On January 12, 1948, a 44-year-old historian died of cancer in a hospital in Hanover. His name was Gerd von Rundstedt. Weeks earlier, his father had been allowed to leave a British prison camp to sit at his bedside before being taken back to England. That father was Gerd von Rundstedt, the German army's most senior field marshal, once called on by Hitler to lead army groups in France, in the Soviet Union, and in the defense of the West. He had survived the war. Within 5 years, his son and his wife would be dead, and so would he. On January 22, 1902, a young Prussian officer married Louise von Goertz. Everyone in the family called her Bela. Gerd von Rundstedt was 26, born in the Saxon town of Aschersleben in December 1875, into a line that had sent its men into Prussian service for generations. The following year, Bela gave birth to a son. They named him Gerd. He would be their only child. Bela came from minor nobility, and the marriage would last half a century. She was the constant of Rundstedt's private life across 2 world wars, the person he returned to between postings and campaigns. For 50 years, she remained the fixed point in a life otherwise spent in barracks, headquarters, and the field. The Rundstedts belonged to an old military caste, the kind of family that measured itself in regiments and commands rather than money. Gerd rose slowly and steadily through the Imperial Army, served as a staff officer in the First World War, and stayed on in the small force Germany was permitted after 1918. He was a soldier of the old school, formal, reserved, and determined to see himself as separate from politics. He had little respect for the Nazi Party and sometimes mocked its leaders in private, yet he continued to serve the regime at the highest level throughout its wars, a contradiction that would shape how history remembered him. By the late 1930s, he was among the most respected officers in Germany, and when the Second World War came, Hitler turned to him again and again. Rundstedt commanded the army group that broke through in France in 1940, led forces into the Soviet Union in 1941, and served as commander-in-chief in the West when the Allies landed in Normandy in 1944. In July 1940, Hitler had promoted him to Field Marshal, and for the rest of the war, he was treated as the grand old man of the officer corps. Hitler dismissed him and recalled him more than once, leaning on his prestige whenever the military situation worsened, because few officers carried comparable seniority. Through all of it, his closest ties stayed the same: his wife Bela, their only son, and the officer corps to which he had given his life. Rundstedt gathered neither a wide circle of friends nor a fortune. When the Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, that small world was pulled into the wreckage with him. Father and son were taken prisoner on the same day. Gerd did not follow his father into a fighting career. He was a scholar. He earned a doctorate and took a post as a librarian at Berlin University, working among records and documents while his father commanded armies in the field. By temperament, he was bookish and mild, a world away from the parade ground. For a family that had produced soldiers for generations, a son who chose the archive over the regiment was something unusual. In September 1935, he married Editha von Oppen, known in the family as Dieter. She was no ordinary officer's wife. She held a doctorate in economics and worked in government administration in Berlin and later in occupied Paris. Between 1936 and 45, the couple had 5 children: Barbara, Gerd, Eberhard, Editha, and Paul, the youngest born in the last year of the war. The Field Marshal now had 5 grandchildren, a new generation of Rundstedts arriving as Germany drove toward ruin. In 1942, Gerd was assigned to the Army's War History Library in Berlin, not to the front, but to the official record of the very war his father was helping to command. Despite his father's position, Gerd remained a lieutenant and never became a senior officer. From 1943, he served directly on his father's staff in occupied France. For a stretch, the family was almost gathered in one place. Editha's administrative work had also brought her to Paris, and for a time the war kept the 3 of them within reach of the same headquarters. It did not last. As the front collapsed through 1944 and 45, the territory under that headquarters shrank until there was little left to command. For the last 2 years of the war, the 2 men were side by side, the most senior soldier in the army, and his quiet scholar son keeping the paperwork in order. They were still together on May 1, 1945, when American troops reached the Bavarian town of Bad Tolz. Rundstedt, ill and worn down, was taken prisoner. His son was taken with him, and would not live to see his father released. The father was a prize. As Germany's most senior surviving field marshal, Gerd von Rundstedt was flown to England for interrogation and held alongside other captured commanders. His son followed him into the camp system, not because the British wanted the lieutenant, but because keeping the father and son together was treated as a humane gesture. Hans Gerd passed through the interrogation at Wilton Park in Buckinghamshire and a camp at Grisdale Hall in the Lake District before reaching Special Camp 11 at Island Farm, near Bridgend in South Wales, where Britain held its most senior German prisoners. The camp had recently been the scene of Britain's largest German prisoner escape, when dozens of men tunneled out before all were recaptured. A British assessment of Hans Gerd survives in the camp records. It called him the baby of the family among the generals, noted that he had been brought there on compassionate grounds in order to be with his father, and remarked that his English was reasonably good. He taught beginner's English to other prisoners and, in the eyes of his captors, fussed anxiously around the senior men. While in captivity, Hans Gerd began suffering from serious problems with his throat. The camp doctors were unable to help him. He was released from British custody in early 1947 and returned to Hanover, where it became clear that he had cancer. By the summer, he was in hospital, and there was little hope that he would recover. In 1947, the British allowed Rundstedt to leave the prison camp for a short visit to his dying son. It was the first time he had seen his wife since 1945, and the first time he had met some of his grandchildren. After the visit, he was taken back to England. Hans Gerd von Rundstedt died in Hanover on January 12, 1948, at the age of 44. His father was allowed to travel to Hanover once more for the funeral. Hans Gerd had spent the war working with the army's historical records. Now he was dead at 44, leaving Dieter alone with 5 children. Whatever the Allies eventually decided to do with Rundstedt, he had already suffered the greatest loss of his captivity. The case against Rundstedt dragged on for years. The British had drawn up a list of senior German commanders they meant to try for war crimes. Among them, Walter von Brauchitsch, Erich von Manstein, Adolf Strauss, and Rundstedt himself. The charges reached back to what the armies under their command had done during the war. On January 1, 1949, the British charged Rundstedt with a series of war crimes. The charges included his role in passing on 2 criminal orders, the Commissar Order, which condemned captured Soviet political commissars to death, and the Commando Order, which denied captured Allied commandos the protections given to prisoners of war. They also covered the mistreatment of civilians and prisoners, forced labor, and crimes against Jews under German occupation. Rundstedt had commanded army groups in which such orders were carried out, and a trial would have weighed his personal responsibility. It never took place. Rundstedt was elderly and in poor health. He was in his 70s, his heart was weak, and years of captivity had weakened him further. Early in 1949, British doctors examined him and concluded he was unfit to stand trial. On May 5, 1949, the government confirmed in the House of Lords that the charges against Field Marshal von Rundstedt and Colonel General Strauss were being dropped. Rundstedt was released later that month. Manstein, by contrast, was judged fit enough to stand trial. One of Germany's most celebrated commanders, he was convicted at Hamburg that same year on 9 counts and sentenced to 18 years. Rundstedt, spared by his poor health, was simply let go. He returned to Hanover in 1949, the city where his son had died, and for a short time was reunited with Biela. It did not last. In January 1952, Biela suffered a stroke that left her partly paralyzed. By then, Rundstedt himself could barely walk. On October 4, 1952, Biela died in Hanover after 50 years of marriage. With his wife gone and his only son 4 years in the grave, Rundstedt declined quickly. Those close to him said he felt he had little left to live for. Gerd von Rundstedt died of heart failure on February 24, 1953 in Hanover, less than 4 months after Biela. He was 77. His reputation would remain tied to the regime he had served. The family lived on. Dieter, Hans Gerd's widow, lived until 1982, more than 30 years after his death, raising 5 children who had lost their father young. They grew up with a name that remained closely tied to the defeated German officer corps, while the country around them tried to leave that world behind. Little of their later lives entered the public record, but several married and had families of their own, and the Rundstedt line continued into another generation. The Rundstedt name had stood for military service since long before the Kaiser, and it survived into a republic that had no place for field marshals. Gerd von Rundstedt had outlasted the German Empire, the Weimar Republic, and the Third Reich that had each employed him, but he did not long outlive his wife and only son. The traditions survived in the family name. The household at its heart did not. If you found this video insightful, watch our video on what happened to Friedrich Paulus's wife and children after World War II next. And for more forgotten aftermath stories from the Second World War, subscribe to History Inside. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.